Moving on to Ari Edmundson, our HCE lecturer.
Hello, hi everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to be back. The first time I've done this in person since 2019, and I had to miss last year because of the birth of my first child. So excited to kind of be back in the room with all of you here to talk about the Human Context and Ethics program that I help to run and teach here in the Data Science Undergraduate Studies program in CDSS. So what is this program? I'm going to go through this in a few different ways with you. In short, right, this is a program for building in ethical, human context-oriented training for data science undergraduates into the curriculum, training the next generation of responsible data practitioners. And I'm going to start kind of this presentation by talking about the who. As we remind our students, when we're talking about data and human context, we start with the people, the who of the program. So I'm going to start there before we jump into the kind of what and how. So here is both myself on one side and Catherine Carson over here, who is a professor and chair in the Department of History and affiliated faculty in Science, Technology, and Society, STS. We'll say more about sort of your role. Catherine has been involved in data science at Berkeley since its very beginnings and has been instrumental in sort of creating a lot of what we have here, in particular the Human Context and Ethics program. I actually got my start while I was doing my PhD in the history department here at Berkeley, and actually started by teaching courses as a graduate student instructor, finished up my PhD in 2019 and have been a lecturer and teaching and helping develop the program and develop curriculum here ever since. So we teach some of the main core courses and are sort of responsible currently for running the program and developing some new curriculum and running a student team. But we have a student team. It's not just us doing all of this work. So I wanted to give credit to at least this is the spring version of our Human Context and Ethics undergraduate student team. Some folks on this list have already graduated, but wanted to throw them up here because we've got their photos and everything. And this is part of a team that's been doing really, really incredible instrumental work in developing novel curriculum and helping disseminate the work that we do to the wider world. So what exactly is some of the work that we do? I'll do the kind of really boring overview to start with, the kind of schematic scaffolding of what are the various things that we, in HCE, as we kind of call it, Human Context and Ethics for short, what are the things that we do? Okay, well, really simply, we teach courses. There is something called Data4AC, Data and Justice. And by the way, I'm going to go over some of these later. This is kind of a rough outline of what's to come and what I'm going to cover. So we have a couple of courses, Data4AC, Data and Justice, and then Data C104, Human Context and Ethics of Data, which is actually the kind of original course that birthed a lot of what is HCE here at Berkeley. So those are dedicated courses dedicated to kind of teaching and training students in our particular approach, perspectives, methods, and tools of human context that are really focused, again, on the kind of humanistic and social scientific perspectives to complement the more technical training in other courses. But we don't want the work that we do to actually sort of stand alongside and be completely independent of the technical courses at UC Berkeley. Because ultimately, training students to become responsible data practitioners involves practice. It involves getting it to become really integrated into the kind of basic central core parts of their education to make some of these ideas and perspectives and tools kind of habits, just central to doing good data practice. So we've developed course materials. Some of them are kind of modular and can be exported, but a lot of them have been initially developed for Data 100. And you're going to hear all about that course after this presentation. I'll tell you a little bit about one of the kind of curriculum packages centered on notebook modules that we've done for Data 100. We've also developed some general curricular materials. Michaela just mentioned the data science ethos lifecycle is one of these things that we've contributed to. We also have our own sort of toolkit, a set of social scientific tools that are sort of generalizable ways, structured ways of thinking about the world that students can learn in our courses, but they can also take with them outside and beyond the walls of the university. We also do various kinds of program support, doing sort of little trainings and workshops, helping with teacher training, helping with sort of getting everybody in the data science undergraduate studies program sort of up to speed on the HCE approach to things. And we're leaning into a kind of particular kind of research area, although this is sort of still in the future a little bit. We're starting to develop a new community-based partnerships program that would initially start in our Data4AC course that would actually have students developing novel research projects together with actual local community members and activists. So starting a project, not sort of creating a project separately, then going to some community and saying, hey, I'm going to fix your problem for you, but starting locally and from the ground up. And this is something we are just starting to build right now. Okay, so that's the schematic kind of overview. But what really is human context and ethics? Well, I'll start actually with the why. Now, all of you, I'm sure, have some sense that and a lot of the presentations in this conference so far have really kind of insisted, yes, there's this important human and social element that's central to data science education. We have a particular kind of read on that, and I'm going to review a sort of set of sort of basic foundational statements, pillars of HCE education at UC Berkeley that sort of justify our particular approach. I'll start with this first claim. It might seem pretty straightforward and uncontroversial. Data science is deeply social. That is, at every single level, what data is involved, entangled with social and human contexts. The level of problem formulation, every kind of part of the life cycle, problem formulation, data collection, the reasons we build technologies that integrate into the world in the first place, data science in particular. Now, this is actually true of all kinds of science and technology, but we think it's particularly true of data science. It really grew up, it emerged in part as a response to industry demands. It's emerged in a moment that's in which data science is very much remaking the fabric, the basic infrastructures of our everyday lives. So we start with this premise that really justifies HCE needs to be super, super central to data science education. We also then say power and ethical action are at stake. And we put up power here first and don't just simply start with ethics, because we want to say that part of what's going on is not simply individual people, designers, technologists, data scientists making sort of their own discrete decisions, but rather they're doing so in these broader contexts that are defined by power. They occupy positions of power. Data scientists, the corporations, the companies they work for are increasingly powerful presences in today's world. So thinking about ethical action is something that takes place within these contexts of power is an absolutely central presupposition of everything we do. And then finally, and this one takes us a little bit further, we say that responsible data science involves something more than technical training. Now, what that something more is what I'm really going to get to a little bit just now. But given these first two kind of premises, we'd say that actually acting responsible with your data, practicing with your data, involves certainly technical training and rigorous technical training, but there's perspectives and forms of expertise and tools that can be drawn from the humanities and social sciences that are sort of necessary in order to actually kind of act responsibly and ethically. Okay, so we say that HCE then, given all of this, has some really strong interdisciplinary foundations. It doesn't begin, though, with abstract philosophical speculations and a moral kind of learning and going through rote learning of traditional Western moral philosophical frameworks, discussing abstract, hypothetical scenarios like the trolley problem here, which is a kind of a frequently invoked discussion topic to sort of talk about the ethical choices and decision-making in discrete kind of moments. It's been revived in an age of automated decision-making systems and particularly automated vehicles. But we think that that kind of approach is like, let's imagine a particular technology, abstract away from the very real world, and then start saying like, well, what would you do? Really misses the key dimension of what ethical action really looks like and is. That is, ethics is always contextual. It's always relational. It's not about abstract and universal principles. It starts with the local and the specific. At the same time, we try to avoid another, I think, really typical and problematic approach to teaching STEM ethics. And that's sort of a review of sort of news events or sort of topics that are just sort of raised for discussion. We go through one topic to the next and sort of see what everybody thinks and feels about it. Although, of course, looking at current events, bringing these kind of really concrete real world studies is so central to what we do. This sort of unstructured approach doesn't really actually help students navigate a future in which the particular situations they confront are going to look very different than the ones they see here. They need something more structured, something more generalizable than simple experience with a handful of topics and examples. So what we then say is HCE here at Berkeley involves teaching students structured ways of thinking about the concrete context of what we call the datafied world. In many ways, the subject of a lot of our classes is this thing called the datafied world. It's not simple individuals making decisions. It's about understanding the background, understanding the world that we inhabit, that we make together, a world that is being made and remade constantly in and through data and data technologies. And there are some tools that folks in the humanities and social sciences, in particular in a field called STS, Science, Technology, and Society, have developed to help us think through exactly what's at stake, where to look, what kinds of questions to ask when we go about doing our work as data scientists. So just to give you a little taste of this and to kind of come back down from this abstract level of talking about what we do, I want to just like raise an example, a kind of topic, and then suggest just one little way that we can start thinking about it in some structured ways. So a really common topic of a lot of data ethics courses is predictive policing. We talk about prediction in many different ways in a lot of different contexts. Predictive policing is a really big, hot button and really important issue concerning social and racial justice today. Now, there's a lot of ways into that topic, a lot of different ways to approach it. What I want to start with is just even very basically thinking. Okay, predictive policing, just for those of you who maybe don't know, generally covers a couple different approaches to reforming police practices, often touted as a way of making policing fair, getting rid of kind of subjective bias of individual police officers and allocating resources more efficiently to where crime actually happens. This is the kind of justification of these practices. They take one of two forms usually, sometimes called place-based predictive policing, that is issuing risk scores for particular neighborhoods or locations at specific times to direct resources towards, or person-based, that is risk scores attached to specific individuals based on, in both cases based on historical data about these places and times, criminal records, and social network information. Now, the question I want to pose to you, and maybe it seems just too palpably obvious, but let me know. The question I want to pose to you is, what do you think these systems are actually predicting? A predictive system that is risk scoring a person or place in one way or another. What's actually being predicted? Anybody have just a guess? Maybe it seems so obvious that it's fine to say the thing that seems obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, pre-crime livestock.
Okay, so one of the things that often gets invoked, and it's one that we invoke because it's something police officers and the companies building these things like to invoke, is Minority Report, sort of this predicting an actual crime that an individual is going to commit before it happens, and then arresting them. And there's all these sort of clear, like this clearly violates due process rights and everything. We don't start there, however, because that's not how it actually works. And that's not principally, of course, what's at stake. They're not predicting specific crimes that are actually going to happen, but of course, likelihoods of criminal activity at certain times to warrant greater surveillance and scrutiny. Any other thoughts about what precisely is being predicted? Yeah. Convictions. So one of the things that they might be predicting, depending on the data set, is predicting the likelihood that there will be something that happens that will lead to a conviction. Right. And so note, and I'll just kind of take over here for a second, that convictions is one of many different ways of categorizing and classifying this thing called crime. And so a lot of times when you talk to students about predictive policing and you show them a data set that's maybe used to generate to build machine learning algorithms on top of, to train them and to make predictions about these sorts of things, they think, okay, what I'm trying to do is predict the likelihood that a crime is going to take place. And they think of crime as a natural kind, a thing that just simply happens in the world And they're trying to have the lowest error rates for predicting that crime actually happening. The problem there is it treats the data itself as a kind of neutral, transparent representation of an event in the world that is supposedly independent of the data collection itself. Of course, that's not actually the case. Because what is a crime? A crime is whatever particular social systems decide to label and call a crime, whether it's convictions, whether it's arrests, whether it's incarcerations. And that means that what's being predicted is not some objective fact out there independent of the instruments that are counting, some fact of the world, but a very product of the ways of counting themselves. So what these systems are actually doing is they're predicting interactions between, say, police officers or courts and individuals who then become labeled as committing crimes. This is not to say that there aren't acts in the world, there isn't violence or theft, but there's no such thing as simply objective breaking of the law. These things are all up to subjective discretion and interpretation. Crimes, as they show up in data, are simply what society reports and labels. So if we want our students to look at that kind of data, to think about when I'm building a predictive system, say in a context of policing, and I'm trying to make it as equitable as possible, you're ultimately limited by the data. And this isn't just a question of garbage in, garbage out, and biased data, because in one sense, it's a very objective representation of the world. Again, not of activities on the ground by just communities that are being surveilled, but an objective representation of particular institutions and systems, that is police departments and courts, that make particular kinds of decisions about what counts as crime. So how they count crime determines what counts as crime. And now that tells us we have to look at these institutions, we have to look at their histories, we have to look at their practices and their norms, all of these specific contexts that affect exactly how that policing takes place. And that's when we start to look at issues of racial bias. It's not simply about disparate error rates that we can correct by getting more granular data. It's actually a problem that exists at the level of the institutions doing the collecting of the data and actually doing much more than collecting it, actually affecting dramatically people's individual lives with those acts of counting by arresting them, putting them in prison, and so on. So the level of racial disparities that show up at this level is not simply a product of bad data, but is a product of actual real life practices. So if we want to talk about creating a more just world in and through policing, it doesn't simply start with collecting more and better data about crimes. It starts with looking at the ways that data is part of the very social systems that you're building something for. And that's one of the fundamental kind of moves and structures that we try to get students used to thinking about at every level of the kind of work they do, especially in working with human and social data. A lot of this, by the way, goes for things that might seem like, okay, that's really true of something that's obviously socially constructed like crime. But all data is made. All data is made by people. It's all made by people to do something in the world, to make arguments, to carry authority, to convince others of something. This is true of air quality data. Catherine Carson, in one of our lectures, has a beautiful example of the ways in which things like air quality data are made and the stakes of the different ways that we can kind of break up and classify and represent the world that are, to their core, always very political, not just kind of ethical, but social and political. So with that in mind, and this is the last thing I'll say, go over before I kind of talk more specifically about our course design, is getting ultimately to, so what do we mean by responsible data practice? Given this, what does it involve? And you can think of this sort of as our learning objectives, right, for training responsible data practitioners. It's not simply getting people to be more ethical in some generic sense. We're not here to be moral superegos telling students what's right and what's wrong. We're trying to help them think in particular ways about what's at stake, about how society and technology interact with one another, so they're in a position to make the kinds of decisions, to work with others, to think about themselves in particular ways that are most conducive to kind of ethical and justice-oriented action in the world. So with that, here's this kind of quick overview and 3 different categories. I'll start with this one, which I think of as the kind of cognitive dimensions of our learning objectives. Understanding the world. This covers that sort of understanding how social systems and technical systems interact and change each other. What we call drawing on STS vocabulary, we say co-production. Society and technology and science co-produce one another, make each other what they are. So understanding the world they live in is foundational. Then imagining what's possible. That is actually thinking beyond the present, the moment that you're in, the particular sort of things and situations that are given, and thinking beyond that and into the future. What else is possible? When I build something and design something, what are some of the possible effects? Trying to make sure you're not using unintended consequences as an excuse not to think about what are possible consequences of the decisions that I make as a practitioner. And then reflexivity about oneself, knowing not just who you are, but who you are as a social being, who you are as an expert. We spend a lot of time talking with students about what's the nature of your expertise as a data scientist. What do you know? What authorizes that knowledge? What makes others believe in what you have to say? And what are the limits of that expertise? When do you know you're working on something that pushes up against the limits of what you can actually speak to given your domain expertise and the work that you've done? Who are the other potential stakeholders that you need to be thinking about and engaging and actually doing the kind of work that you need to do? How does your positionality, that is your race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, immigration status, relative to those you're working with, affect the kind of work that you're doing? That all falls under this category of reflexivity. Then I'd say this is the kind of normative dimension. It's a little of an artificial distinction here, but bear with me. The normative distinction, the sort of really thinking about the kind of the oughts, the like, how ought I act? Again, not telling students this is what you ought to do in any situation, but sensitizing students to moments where they're called to make normative decisions about how to act and how it's going to affect others. So we say sensitivity to ethical context. That is being in a situation to be able to recognize that you're dealing with something that's really fraught. And a lot of students come in thinking data ethics is just about privacy. That's all I have to be paying attention to. That's where data ethics lies. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to help train students to become sensitive to all the other areas, domains of life where ethical stakes show up and become relevant. Orientation to justice, kind of closely related to that, but a little bit different. It's a sort of always thinking about the work that you do. What kind of world am I actually building? It's not simply responding like sensitivity to particular situations, looking at what might be at stake here, but when I'm actually making things, when I'm building stuff, what kind of world is it I'm contributing to? And am I building a more just world, whatever just may mean? We talk about that a lot in some of our courses. But exactly, what's the point? What's the vision of a good life together with others that I'm aiming for in the work that I'm doing? And then lastly, critique of unjust institutions. Now I come out of a tradition called critical theory, so I've spent a lot of time like thinking a lot about this. But critique, that is actually directing oneself towards the existing state of affairs, the kinds of either myths or ideologies or practices, institutions that one might be a part of that are often part of creating injustice in the world. And so learning how to think through, this idea that like, of what we call technological determinism, that technology ultimately is the single shaping force and motor of history that actually controls history. Society can simply react to technology. It's a harmful myth, it's a problem. It's when we push students to think about critique instances of this way of thinking that's actually quite pervasive in a lot of technical circles. And then third, and this is the kind of action practical dimension, learning how to communicate with others, verbally in written form, learning how to communicate and collaborate with others, not just with others on your design team at the workplace, but learning good communication skills that serve one in reaching out beyond kind of the often narrower domains of the disciplinary work or industry work that you do. How to reach out and communicate with non-experts in your particular area to bring them in to make them understand what it is you're doing. And then finally, practical judgment and action. That is knowing how to act in a really broad sense in situations, knowing when to pick your battles, knowing, being that kind of this practical kind of wisdom and sensibility of what can and can't I do, when and what are the kind of pressure points that can actually help me achieve certain kinds of change and build more just worlds using my particular expertise. Okay, so that's our kind of image of like, what are we aiming to get students to do? What kind of data scientist are we trying to cultivate? It's a person that embodies sort of this kind of set of characteristics, abilities, and skills. And by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any point if you do have questions about any of this. All right, now we can move on to talking a little bit about the course design and curriculum in the remaining time that I have with you today. So as I showed at the beginning, there's two major courses that we teach. There are other courses at UC Berkeley that fulfill the human context and ethics requirement for the major and minor, taught by faculty in other departments. But these are kind of the two courses that we teach. And Data 104, even though the number is higher, it's older and bigger. So we'll talk about it first. This is the kind of big central data course that counts for the human context and ethics requirement for all data science majors and minors at UC Berkeley. And it's very much the place out of which our whole approach to HCE really grew. This class goes back to 2018. That's when it was first offered and taught by Professor Catherine Carson, Margot Beinig-Lipson, who used to be in our program and has now moved on to another institution. And I joined as a GSI at the time, in the spring of 2018. It was a small 50-person class. And it's quickly scaled up, and we now teach 475 students per semester and teach that twice a year. So we're covering just under 1,000 students per year with this course. So what does this class do? This is the one that really is the kind of broad, we're trying to ultimately train and cultivate students that embody those kind of characteristics I just talked about. This is really meant for future data practitioners to learn kind of these basic ways of thinking, structured ways of thinking about the world, to orient themselves in it, to get a sense of what's at stake in the work they do. As I suggested earlier, it's this thing called the datafied world that's sort of the object of the class. So we kind of start in the very first unit with this thing called our datafied world. We're setting the stage. Ethics, in one formulation that Catherine has used not infrequently, is that the world is sort of the stage upon which ethics unfolds. So we start not with ethics, but with the world. What is this world? How is it being remade? What are the key dimensions to look for? What is exactly a world being made and remade through data analytics, collection, machine learning, automated decision-making systems, AI, et cetera. So we kind of lay out the background there. We then move on to, I guess, what you could call the ethics unit, responsible data in unit 2, a place where we actually go and look at existing ethics institutions more broadly in scientific research, look at the ways that they're being applied to data science research, but also suggest some of the limitations of these existing research frameworks for regulating responsible data practice today. Things like codes of ethics, things like IRBs that emerged in a particular time and place. For historians, we spend a lot of time talking about what were the contexts these emerged from, what needs did they apply to, what are the ways in which the world has also evolved and changed such that we need to update and modify our approach to thinking about how to generate more ethical outcomes. Then we also review, that's where we get to things like moral philosophical frameworks and look at why they're so limited as an approach to talking about ethics and why we need something much broader, more contextual, more flexible, more informed by social science and STS in particular. Unit 3 is the place where we touch on that topic most incoming students identify with data ethics, privacy. But it's only one part of a larger story about what happens when people are made into data. What's involved, what's at stake, what happens, what are the various different histories of how we became what one author has called informational persons. What happens to selfhood? And then we talk about privacy in there, but also say that privacy is not always what we think it is. It's not something that's foundational to our American political system going back to the Bill of Rights. It's actually a quite recent concern and focus of kind of cultural and legal concern that really mostly dates back just to the 1960s and 70s. And also, what we call privacy is quite often not, strictly speaking, privacy, but really is about power. It's really about surveillance. It's really about social structure, and not simply about, oh, it feels creepy that I know that companies have all this data about me. It's more than data security and having one's private information, credit card numbers, et cetera, social security numbers stolen. Quite often when we talk about power, it's something that tells us a lot about whatever it is we're concerned about in a certain moment in time. It's a kind of diagnostic. Unit 4 is where we get to talking about data as a kind of social technology. Data is something that forms social order, like many other kind of technologies in the world. What is the role of data? And I use data here in that broad sense to encompass analytics, machine learning, data collection, surveillance, et cetera. Looking at the historical role of particularly the modern state, the role historically of global capitalism in driving the datafication of the world, and the implications and ways that that data has affected governance practices at a number of different levels. We look at the history of eugenics and its ties to practices of to the emergence of modern statistics. We look at recidivism algorithms used in the courtroom. We look at the use of global data and indicators to regulate things like population and birth rates around the world. Unit 5 extends that to look specifically at democracy, looking at issues of misinformation and social media, how elections are datafied, what's at stake, what that means for sort of deep, long-standing democratic structures. Unit 6 then moves on to talk about the economic dimensions, the sort of role of capitalism in driving the datafication of the world, and seeing data quite often as a form of extraction, looking in particular, tuning students to always look for the human beings behind these transformations. What does the datafication of the world mean for labor? What are the forms of labor that make contemporary machine learning run, for instance? Kind of the micro workers on Amazon Mechanical Turk, whose work actually is essential to a lot of what we think of as data science, but we don't actually consider the work they do as contributing to this thing called data science. How do we justly bring them into the picture? And then finally, Unit 7 deals with foundations of data science practice. So looking at what are the kind of consequences of this transformation of the world for kind of scientific epistemology, for research, for reproducibility and replicability, how to think about just scientific transformations in and through time. That's the overview of our topics. How do we actually teach this? Our GSIs are really central to this, our graduate student instructors who serve as TAs. So this is a lecture class, it's a big class. We have to give lectures that serve everybody, that get to everybody. But a lot of the learning in the class happens in small in-person discussion sections. They were virtual, obviously, for a little while, but discussion sections with 25 students. Each one of our GSIs has 2 sections of these 25 students each. They meet weekly for an hour and a half. And it's not just there for reviewing lecture material to make sure students understand it before taking exams. It's really there to dive into the readings. And you can actually check those out. Behind that image, there's actually a for more see our website for this course. You can look at the kinds of readings that we assign. We have other slides that's up there on it. Oh, it's just, yeah, Data 104.
It turns out you can do this.
Oh, great. Data104.org. You can look at sort of lots more about the course, including the readings. But the discussion sections are there for kind of close mentoring from experts from a whole range of different fields. So PhDs, largely PhD, and a few very kind of sort of exceptional master students from a range of disciplines that help shepherd students through the course through really difficult material that you don't want to just sort of hand over to students and have them kind of make sense of it on their own, because it deals with really sensitive topics involving race and gender, power and class, to help them make sense of what's at stake there. To run through, we have a whole handbook full of different kind of structured activities for having conversations around these issues, and for helping students through to their final research projects, their capstone for the course. So this is a reading and writing intensive course. We come again from a kind of liberal arts background. A lot of courses like this have cool design projects, and those can be really great as well. In our case, we've opted for a reading and writing focused research project where students write what we call an HCE vignette. And this is a way of engaging that one element of what we consider responsible data practice, learning how to communicate with broader publics, being reflective and reflexive about one's own and limits of one's own expertise, and trying to get students to think about what does it take to communicate about a significant ethical or social problem with a wider community without dictating a solution to them. So writing for a specific audience in only 1,000 words, clarifying an issue, suggesting what some possible kind of avenues for approaching it is, without saying this is the one and be all. Trust me, I'm an expert. I know how to fix the problem. If you would all just do this, we could deal with it. But rather thinking about who are the stakeholders, how might their input be important? How do I enroll them into this process of addressing a particular problem? And that's the kind of main, the kind of capstone piece of that course. I'll end just because I don't have time to get through all of the slides because we started a little bit late. But I wanted to point as well to this newer course, Data for AC, which fulfills the American Cultures requirement at UC Berkeley, which is a requirement. It's the only requirement for all students at Cal, which is meant to focus on the kind of racial and ethnic histories and social contexts of the United States. And so this is a new course that looks and tries to help students that are not necessarily planning to be data scientists or data practitioners think about ways in which data could be useful for them in pursuing social justice. Again, not in ways where they're going to kind of create solutions for others and a lot of the traditional data science for social good orientations, but thinking about how do you reach out to other communities and build more just worlds together. I'm happy to talk more another time about what has gone into this course, how it's built, what we talk about, but I don't want to run into our next presentation on Data 100. We'll make these slides available so you can learn a little bit more about the Jupyter Notebook modules we have in this course and the particular capstone group projects that we do here. Thank you all for having me. I look forward to having some conversations with you all.